Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me go back to Joachim. You made an interesting statement about Africa in its quest to move towards the middle income status would require population movement, both within the continent and outside the continent. As you know, it is happening right now across the Mediterranean, and I'm not sure that is what you meant. Could you clarify a little bit more exactly what you perceive would be the right type of migration, both within the continent and outside the continent?
Yeah, thank you for giving me the chance to clarify. I did not talk about the right type of migration. I talked about an empirical fact. When countries move from low income to middle income, people get on the move. Why? For a very simple economic reason. They have the resources to move. It costs money to move, to live up to the aspirations which they had all the time before. These aspirations are now accelerating very quickly because people who move from low to almost middle income situation know in great detail about other labor markets, other opportunities. This economic force of migration, of course, also relates to agriculture development or lack thereof. We observe two reasons for migration currently: pull and push. The push comes because of lack of development, of political disturbances, of violence, of war. Those are refugees. I didn't talk about refugees, but many of the people who are refugees also want to have a better life, and who would blame them for that? So they are refugees and migrants at the same time. I think we have to really get together between Europe and Africa to find solutions which serve both sides. I fail to see a good conversation on that topic. So I really welcome your penetrating question, Godfrey, to clarify the issue. I think we in the academic communities can spearhead such conversations and should do that. Policymakers may be too timid to discuss these touchy topics, but we should not. So I think this is a very complex issue which requires a complex response. At the core of it, again, is education and higher education. Many of the people who move not just to move into a job, they want to get better education in order to, because they know only if they get that, they will have a higher sustainable income. Out of that would come circular migration. We should offer that. Education coupons could be paid by the European Union and redeemed in African colleges, universities, or vocational training centers. Let's be creative. But in the short term, help is needed for those who endanger their lives and those of their loved ones by crossing under dangerous circumstances the Mediterranean. So there's the humanitarian side which we also jointly need to address. This is a topic for a whole different conference. I stop here.
Okay, thank you. And I won't ask additional questions, follow-up questions on that, otherwise we'll get deep into that now. So Boaz, back to the issue of the private sector in agricultural development on the continent. Now, as you know, the Grow Africa, I've been told not to use the word initiative. Yes, but it evolved to support private sector development or investment in African agriculture in 2012. and rightly so, and both supporting the evolution of domestic and foreign private sector interests in Africa's agriculture. So 2-3 years down the road, what's your take? Are we seeing increased interest in both domestic and private sector investment in Africa's agriculture? And if not, what may be still constraining that interest or move towards more investment on the continent?
I think the interest for private sector investment, both globally and domestically, is increasing. I think what we need to go back and ask the question is whether what has defined a more interest from the global system as opposed to what has been the case before. And part of the answer to that question is that I think the market globally is getting saturated in terms of investments, even in other areas of investments, but agriculture is more attractive. And if you look at the instrument of attraction globally, Africa is more placed in terms of availability of land to invest more in agriculture, the conducive environment that's being created, and also the shift in the mindset of political decision makers from being politically heavy to private sector driven kind of. So we begin to see the political economy shifting from being political actors than before. But with Grow Africa on board and having, I think the fundamental change that has happened is that it has created a new style of public-private engagement and therefore partnerships. Because previously it has, as I mentioned earlier, it used to be the monopoly of government to institute policies, decisions on the assumption that the private sector would invest. But the style and the method of work that Grow Africa and other approaches that were brought on board was to create a more genuine, feasible dialogue between public actors and the private sector. So that is increasing the interest as well. But it comes with a series of questions. And most of you are aware that even when you want to increase investments in agriculture, there has been questions on whether the surge for foreign direct investments can likely either crowd in or crowd out the domestic private sector. So that debate has also been emerging. And some of the solutions have, again, gone back to government, the nature and the type of policies that you bring in to not only attract foreign direct investment, but more than protect and strengthen domestic private sector. Crowd in rather than crowd out. And those are policy-driven movements. And I will begin to see this one increasing. And governments are now shifting the style of policy making to more bring in private sector, both domestic and international.
Thank you. I'll let the audience continue with you on that one. So my last question is going to go to Kwesi. I was intrigued by your call, and I think probably correctly so, for strategic breeding, especially in reference to emerging challenges in agriculture, and those are the rampant diseases for crops and livestock, as well as the breeding for against climate change, right? So you work for IITA. Do you have examples of efforts by IITA towards breeding for these or against these challenges, not only at your institute, but are you also creating partnerships with governments in that area?
Yeah, thank you, Godfrey. Yeah, I wouldn't even speak just in the name of IITA. I would say that the CGIAR system as a whole was really created, and the strength of the CGIAR system has been in the area of breeding against these sort of elements. In the early years, a lot of emphasis was placed on productivity gain, but that productivity gain issue has really been settled to quite a large degree. And with all the changes taking place, there is now a very strong shift towards breeding that responds to the challenges of climate change. So you begin to see a center like IRRI, which is the International Rice Research Institute, beginning to breed the kind of rice that can be flooded over a number of weeks and still retain its, viability, because it is seen that in quite a lot of rice-growing areas, you would find scenarios like that. A center like ReSAKSS has really, and ICARDA, that really works in dry areas, they have massive breeding programs with national partners that are looking at drought tolerance, as well as particular breeding efforts that are targeted to addressing pest challenges. But let me say that all this is part of the challenge of the very high risk that we face in agriculture. I mean, we really need to put ourselves in the place of the smallholders to be able to appreciate the degree of risk that they face. And I think this is too high, and we therefore need to be able to find incentive mechanisms for sustainable agricultural growth, especially for the majority of smallholder farmers. And when I talk of risk, it includes technical risk, it includes natural risk, including the climate change issue we've talked about, and it also includes economic risk. One word I haven't heard much of is insurance, the place of insurance in taking some of that risk. And all those are elements that we need to put a lot of investment in as we move to the future to be able to achieve the kind of goals that are set for agriculture.
Thank you. Thank you, Kwesi. Now I would like to open up the discussion to the plenary. We do have another about 20 minutes for you to interact with the panelists. So you are free to ask questions to everybody on this panel except me. My role is to moderate. So the floor is open. Keep it short and crisp so that also the responses will be likewise. So I'll begin with you. Give your name and the institution so that the panelists can know who they are responding to.
Thank you very much. My name is Yusuf Abubakar, Executive Secretary at Agricultural Research Council of Nigeria. My question is directed to Professor von Braun. The concept of science-based innovation by economy is very interesting, and I think...
Can you speak closer to the microphone so that we can hear you?
All right. I said the concept of science and innovation based by economy is very interesting, and I think it offers a very positive policy shift towards industrialization. However, development of industrial clusters usually connote predominant involvement and engagement of the private sector, which is good, as that will drive industrialization faster. But how do you ensure that in this process, smallholder farmers are not crowded out? Because the tendency is that when you are developing industrial clusters, you tend to lean more towards the private sector and involvement in government in terms of putting infrastructure. So how do you ensure that you don't crowd out smallholder farmers? Thank you.
Thank you. There was a hand here.
My name is Kop Eb Dabugat from Nigeria, and I'm here on behalf of the CNC. I have just one quick question concerning basically how we can integrate the trends of migration within the country now. The rural-urban migration, for example, that is really endemic within Africa, expanding the urban populations. How do we ensure that investment policies seek perhaps to pull back the population at the rural areas where the agriculture really happens? considering the fact that those that actually move from the rural areas to the cities are mostly young people. We all mentioned that youths need to be attracted back to agriculture. Now, how do we attract them back to the locale of agriculture? How do we factor in the ebb and flow of social demographic characteristics of our society into these investment plans of on agriculture? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the lady behind. And then after that, your neighbor, the man.
Thank you. My name is Bridget Mugambe from Uganda. And my first question is to the last speaker, Kwesi. You spoke quite a bit about value chains and their importance. And I just wanted to get a bit of maybe what you think about the whole issue of value chains not being very appealing right now, especially to small-scale producers, because we see that as you go higher the chain, then you earn more, but they're at the level where you're earning less, and they seem to be kept there. So I'd like to understand a bit from you how you feel we could make it more appealing to the producers by ensuring that they earn more from it. Then my other question is to Boaz. You did talk about the role of private sector and the need to see that private sector is an equal partner to government. And my worry about that is that we are increasingly seeing governments leaving the role of policy formulation and policy regulation and, you know, kind of leaving that role to private sector. And I'm wondering how that ties in with the beneficiaries that private sector is supposed to be benefiting, and also government's role in policy regulation and ensuring that whatever initiatives private sector comes up with are actually benefiting the citizens.
Maybe we can first take these four, and then we come back to another round, if any. So I think Joachim had two questions, so I'll let you address those.
Yeah, just briefly, the question from Professor Abu Bakr was related to how to integrate smallholders into a science-based bioeconomy and related industrialization strategies. It's being practiced in Asian countries increasingly, but it's necessary in order to reach scale for any growth process. Small farmers need to cooperate more, find ways to cooperate not just in joint production activities, but also in connecting to processing. So new forms of contracting and of cooperation are needed, and that's where government role is to protect farmers from exploitative contracts. Can be done, is being done. Same story in relation to connecting small farmers to supermarkets, the retail industry. There are good practices and bad practices, and has worked out. Let me add a very general point. I think the basic idea of agriculture here and industry there is outdated. These are outdated concepts. In Latin America, in Brazil in particular, but also in other countries, there's a heated debate on this issue. For a long time, industry was protected, then agriculture, and vice versa. The idea that we are dealing with two different sectors which are against each other needs to be given up, precisely because of lots of industrial processes now connecting to agriculture, and in the science-based bioeconomy, the integration of information and communications technologies and computer-based precision agriculture also negates even the differentiation between agriculture and services. So I think we should just look at business opportunities there and make sure that contracts are fair and sound. The other question was more to the rural-urban migration. I think you said yourself what's needed, sound investment plans, focused, in my opinion, around small towns and mid-sized towns, and not around the mega towns. There's a movement in China building up from urban planners, rural planners, architecture associations, and so on, to deal with that problem of rural-urban migration in new ways and integrate space and come to optimal agglomerations rather than big town here with terrible air and unhealthy environment and remote and useless rural areas where the services have broken down, the schools and hospitals are no longer operating, and people are forced to move into the big urban agglomerations. So I think Africa has an opportunity to create its own spatial allocation of people. I don't think you need to necessarily look at European or Chinese recipes, but the issue needs to be dealt with. If the UN projections are right, that Africa, by the end of this century, should have 3 billion people, you better start thinking, and I'm sure you do, what would be the appropriate land use planning, urban planning, spatial planning in rural areas. A key issue in that context has been raised by you, Kwesi, that is soil and land and its protection. The economic costs of land degradation has been worked on by a team of African scholars in my institute. These costs in countries like Malawi or also Nigeria are tremendously underestimated. We are talking billions, between 5 and 10% of GDP getting lost due to land degradation. And that's part of the story of rural-urban land allocation. Thank you.